Ethan Mercer never imagined that buying a weathered bluffside property along the coast would quietly drag him into one of the strangest neighborhood power struggles anyone could picture. But that changed the moment a self-appointed HOA enforcer named Marlene Holloway decided his legal beach access somehow offended her sense of control. Ethan had purchased the place partly because of a narrow recorded path leading to the shoreline. The kind of detail people skim over until somebody suddenly decides rules only matter when they feel convenient. What started as passive-aggressive complaints, paperwork pressure, and suspicious landscaping changes slowly turned into a full property war centered on power, appearances, and ocean views worth millions. Bro, hearing stories like this always blows my mind because it shows exactly how quickly ordinary people turn territorial. When real estate and status get mixed together, Ethan stayed patient at first, but patience has limits, and what came next unfolded through legal precision, malicious compliance, energy, and consequences nobody in that neighborhood saw coming. 2. Ethan Mercer had not moved to the coast chasing drama. In fact, if anyone had met him 6 months earlier, they would have described him as the exact opposite of someone likely to end up at the center of neighborhood chaos. He was methodical, patient, and the kind of person who read contracts line by line because, in his experience, people loved pretending details did not matter, right up until money or convenience entered the picture. After years of running a quiet commercial surveying business, Ethan finally reached a point where he could justify buying something he had wanted since his 20s, a modest bluffside property overlooking the ocean. Not a mansion, not one of those polished architectural flexes with infinity pools hanging over cliffs, just a weathered house with history and a narrow legal easement running toward the shoreline. The beach access mattered to him more than the house itself. According to county documents, his property included rights to use a slim pedestrian pathway cutting between neighboring lots and descending toward a stretch of public shoreline. It had existed for decades. Survey maps confirmed it, property disclosures confirmed it, even title paperwork confirmed it. Nobody disputed it during closing. To Ethan it seemed straightforward. You buy property. You understand the rules. Everyone minds their business. And simple. That assumption lasted about 11 days. The neighborhood itself looked peaceful on the surface. Carefully trimmed landscaping, expensive SUVs parked in spotless driveways, the sort of place where every mailbox matched, because someone, somewhere, decided visual consistency represented civilization. Ethan noticed quickly that residents moved around with strange energy, smiling just enough to appear polite while simultaneously scanning each other's properties like unpaid inspectors. That alone told him something. Neighborhoods obsessed with appearances almost always carried invisible politics underneath. 3. Then came Marlene Holloway. Marlene lived in one of the larger ocean-facing homes overlooking the bluff. She wasn't technically president of the HOA, though Ethan learned fast that titles meant almost nothing when somebody had enough social influence to behave like management anyway. People listened when she spoke. Contractors nodded nervously around her. Residents lowered their voices when she walked nearby. She had perfected the suburban authority figure aesthetic so completely it almost felt theatrical. Immaculate outfits. Permanent expression of concern. The unmistakable posture of someone who believed inconvenience happening near her qualified as personal disrespect. The first interaction seemed harmless enough. Ethan had spent a Saturday morning walking the beach path, carrying gloves and small garden tools, cleaning drift debris that had collected near the entrance. He figured improving access helped everyone. About halfway through the work, he noticed someone standing uphill watching him. Marlene, not speaking, just observing. Bro, that kind of silent supervision already tells you everything you need to know. People who monitor strangers without introducing themselves usually arrive carrying opinions they forgot to announce. Later that afternoon, a handwritten note appeared near Ethan's mailbox reminding residents to respect community landscaping standards and avoid disturbing designated visual corridors. No signature, no explanation, just vague authority. Ethan ignored it. A few days later came another note, this time laminated. That detail somehow made it worse. The wording suggested the beach path was rarely used and under HOA review for preservation concerns. Ethan reread the sentence 3 times because it made no sense. Preservation of what? Dirt? Shrubs? Gravity? The path existed on recorded legal documents. 4. You cannot casually review somebody else's easement because you suddenly feel emotionally attached to controlling it. Still, Ethan remained calm. He emailed the HOA asking for clarification. The response took 4 days. Cold, carefully vague. Apparently, concerns have been raised regarding traffic patterns, visual integrity, and community quiet enjoyment. Translation: someone was annoyed. Ethan walked the property line himself afterward, carrying survey copies from closing documents. Every marker matched. Everything checked out. The easement remained valid. Case closed? Or at least that was what normal people would assume. A week later, Ethan headed toward the beach before sunrise, carrying coffee, and noticed something weird. Large decorative planters blocked part of the entrance, not fully, just enough to make walking awkward, and the kind of obstruction designed for plausible deniability. Oh no, we didn't block anything. Right? Because somehow giant ceramic containers accidentally migrate into legal pathways. He moved them aside. The next day they returned. This time heavier. Behind them sat a small sign reminding residents to respect private community boundaries. Again, vague wording. Again, no direct statement. Marlene's fingerprints felt spiritually present even without proof. Ethan documented everything. Photos, dates, measurements. If years in surveying taught him anything, it was this: emotional arguments plews against paperwork. Meanwhile, neighborhood interactions grew stranger. People suddenly stopped conversations when Ethan approached. Neighbors offered uncomfortable smiles before quickly mentioning ongoing concerns. One older resident awkwardly suggested Ethan not stir things up. That phrase irritated him immediately, because stirring things up usually means refusing unfair nonsense. Apparently somebody had already built a narrative. The outsider, the difficult homeowner. 5. The man ruining neighborhood peace by wanting access to land he legally paid for. That's exactly how these situations escalate in real life. And honestly, it always amazes me how quickly groups form around convenience over fairness. Nobody cares about rules until rules inconvenience their favorite person. Then came the landscaping incident. Ethan returned home after running errands and nearly laughed from disbelief. Fresh hedges, newly planted, directly beside sections of the pathway, not on his property exactly, but suspiciously close. Close enough to narrow visibility, close enough to make passage feel uncomfortable, close enough to subtly discourage use. He checked county records again, then surveys, then old satellite images. Nothing matched recent placement. Oh. Interesting. Very interesting. Instead of reacting emotionally, Ethan hired an independent surveyor friend to confirm boundaries. The report landed exactly where Ethan expected. Several decorative additions technically encroached near easement limitations. Not dramatic violations, but enough to matter legally, enough to trigger questions. Still, Ethan did nothing, yet he believed in patience. He believed misunderstandings could happen. Maybe someone got overeager with landscaping, so maybe HOA communication genuinely sucked. Then came the neighborhood gathering, and wow, everything suddenly clicked. The event happened on a shared overlook patio facing the ocean. Residents chatted around wine glasses, discussing renovations with terrifying seriousness. Ethan attended mostly because avoiding people only fuels gossip. Marlene found him within minutes. No yelling. No confrontation, just polished hostility. She floated through conversation, making subtle comments about community expectations and shared standards. Every sentence somehow bent toward beach access without naming it directly. The key phrase finally appeared. Ocean view preservation. Hardas persetter. Maraist you winda e. There it was. 6. The real issue. Apparently, increased use of the path meant occasional foot traffic visible from bluffside properties. Foot traffic visible from houses worth absurd money. Foot traffic disrupting the illusion of untouched exclusivity. Suddenly, everything made sense. And the notes, the landscaping, and the pressure campaign. Marlene did not care about preservation. She cared about aesthetics. And her expensive view looked slightly less private when people used the legal pathway below. Bro, hearing that almost made Ethan laugh later because imagine buying property near public access and acting shocked when humans exist near public access. That mindset is wild. After the gathering, Ethan started observing patterns. Whenever he used the trail, Marlene appeared nearby. Whenever guests visited his house, someone suddenly inspected landscaping. HOA emails multiplied, fence concerns, mailbox alignment reminders, questions about paint maintenance. Nothing technically serious, just constant irritation, death by paperwork. Classic strategy, make someone uncomfortable enough that compliance feels easier than resistance. But Ethan had one trait Marlene clearly underestimated. Patience mixed with documentation. Every email got archived, every obstruction photographed, every survey preserved, every timeline recorded. Quietly, carefully, weeks passed. Then one afternoon, Ethan visited the county planning office for unrelated permit research and casually asked about shoreline easements. The clerk explained something interesting, very interesting. Properties overlooking the bluff depended heavily on protected sightline agreements, setback regulations, and vegetation restrictions, especially around shared corridors, especially where easements intersected visual access boundaries. Ethan sat there, rereading public zoning language while a strange realization slowly settled in. Legal access worked both ways. 7. If neighbors insisted on weaponizing technical property standards against him, well, technical standards existed for everybody. And suddenly, for the first time since moving in, Ethan stopped feeling frustrated. He felt curious. Because buried inside maps, ordinances, setback language, and visibility protections, something quietly clicked into place. Something completely legal, something unbelievably inconvenient, something that made the entire situation feel very, very different. And when Ethan walked back to his car that afternoon, one thought repeated itself in his head over and over. If Marlene wanted to turn property rules into a battlefield, then property rules were exactly where this story was headed. By the time Ethan Mercer started connecting the dots, frustration had already transformed into focus. That shift mattered more than people realize. Most neighborhood conflicts spiral because somebody gets emotional too early, sends dramatic emails, loses their temper in public, or turns every inconvenience into a personal war. Ethan had seen enough disputes through surveying work to know one truth. The person who treats documentation like oxygen usually wins. Quiet patience beats loud outrage more often than people think, and Marlene Holloway clearly mistook restraint for weakness. The beach path situation somehow became even more ridiculous over the next several weeks. Small inconveniences started stacking up with suspicious precision, the kind that technically looked accidental while somehow happening a little too consistently to feel random. The decorative planters blocking access returned again, then disappeared, then reappeared. Sometimes a folding chair mysteriously occupied the narrow entrance. Once, somebody had placed decorative rope barriers between landscaping stones near the easement, creating enough confusion that visitors would naturally hesitate before continuing downhill. Nothing outright illegal, just annoying, calculated, passive-aggressive architecture. Bro, that kind of behavior honestly fascinates me because it feels like grown adults reinvent playground politics with bigger budgets. Nobody says you can't come here. Instead, they quietly make everything unpleasant and hope social pressure does the work. Ethan never reacted publicly, never complained, never argued. He simply documented, photo, timestamps, measurements, emails. By now, he had a digital folder so organized it looked like evidence prepared for a documentary narrator. Meanwhile, HOA correspondence somehow escalated into absurdity. One email warned him about inconsistent gravel coloration near his driveway. Another politely requested clarification regarding outdoor storage visibility. Referring to a ladder, Ethan had leaned against his garage for approximately 6 hours. Then came concerns about native plant harmony. Native plant harmony. At that point, Ethan actually laughed because when organizations start inventing poetic violations, you know somebody is digging desperately for leverage. He responded politely every single time. Professional tone, brief answers, and no emotion, no accusations. That alone seemed to irritate people more. Marlene, meanwhile, shifted strategies. Instead of vague notes and landscaping pressure, she started working socially. Ethan noticed it during neighborhood gatherings and casual encounters. Residents suddenly repeated identical phrases. We all just value quiet enjoyment. This neighborhood has standards. We tried to preserve the natural feel, and the wording sounded rehearsed. That detail bothered him, not because of the criticism, but because it revealed coordination. People were being fed narratives, and eventually Ethan discovered exactly why. One evening, while checking his mail, an older homeowner named Richard stopped near the curb wearing the expression of somebody halfway between guilty and exhausted. Richard lived 3 houses uphill and looked permanently tired in the way retirees sometimes do after surviving years of neighborhood committees. He lowered his voice immediately. Apparently, Marlene had been telling residents that Ethan planned to commercialize beach access. Commercialize? As if Ethan secretly intended to build a snack stand halfway down the cliff. The rumor somehow suggested increased traffic, parties, strangers parking nearby, and reduced privacy for homeowners. Completely fabricated, but believable enough for nervous residents already obsessed with property values. That was the moment Ethan stopped assuming misunderstanding. This had become strategy. Marlene wanted pressure, social isolation, narrative control, enough neighborhood discomfort that Ethan eventually gave up using the easement voluntarily. Honestly, hearing stories like this always reminds me how fast communities drift into weird politics when money enters the picture. $1 million views somehow convince ordinary people they deserve authority over reality itself. Still, Ethan remained calm because something much bigger sat quietly in his research folder. The county planning office visit had opened doors, literal paperwork doors. Over several evenings, Ethan reviewed archived permits, easement maps, zoning documents, vegetation regulations, bluff preservation, language and sightline restrictions tied to coastal properties. The deeper he looked, the stranger things became. Turns out bluffside homes in the neighborhood benefited from unusually specific view protections negotiated years earlier. Those protections existed partly to prevent one homeowner from unfairly obstructing another's legally recognized sightline. Vegetation heights, fence setbacks, structural visibility corridors, maintenance responsibilities, all heavily documented, especially near shared access spots. That last part caught Ethan's attention immediately, because while reviewing surveys, he noticed something fascinating. Marlene's property relied on a narrow visual corridor crossing land bordering Ethan's parcel. Not ownership, visibility, a protected line preserving unobstructed ocean scenery from sections of her home. Legally recognized, technically delicate, and suddenly Ethan understood why she cared so much about appearances near the trail. Her view mattered financially a lot. Ocean-facing value on that bluff bordered on absurd. Anything threatening aesthetics became emotional fast. But here was the interesting part. The same regulations protecting sightlines also impose strict landscaping compliance and easement boundary responsibilities. Meaning, and if adjacent access areas required updates for leakage safety, erosion management, or code consistency, certain view impacts could legally occur, temporary or permanent, entirely within regulation. Ethan reread sections twice, and then 3 times, then printed copies, not because he planned revenge immediately, because he wanted certainty. There is a huge difference between anger and leverage. Anger improvises. Leverage waits. Weeks passed. The harassment grew stranger. One morning, Ethan discovered orange utility flags planted near sections of his yard. Unauthorized. No explanation. A follow-up HOA message mentioned possible compliance landscaping recommendations. Recommendations? Funny word. Especially when paired with social pressure. Later that week, somebody anonymously complained about his porch lighting. Another resident awkwardly informed him people considered him difficult. Difficult? Because he used a legal path? That sentence alone deserved framing. Then came the beach gate incident. Technically, there had never been a gate, just an informal wooden opening near the easement entrance. One Saturday morning, Ethan walked outside and stopped cold. 11. A decorative chain now stretched across part of the access point, accompanied by a cheerful little sign requesting residents maintain neighborhood privacy. No direct prohibition, just implication. And again, plausible deniability wrapped in suburban theater. Ethan photographed everything, then checked public records again. That afternoon, he finally hired a coastal property attorney for consultation. Not litigation, consultation. Important distinction. He laid out surveys, HOA correspondence, photographs, easement maps, and timelines across the conference table. The attorney reportedly paused halfway through reviewing materials and gave the universal expression professionals wear when nonsense exceeds expectations. Apparently the obstruction pattern mattered. Apparently repeated interference with lawful access mattered. Apparently selective enforcement complaints against homeowners mattered too. But the attorney said something Ethan never forgot. Don't rush. Simple sentence, massive meaning, because rushed retaliation looks personal, and measured compliance looks reasonable, and legal systems adore reasonable. Bro, hearing that advice probably would have changed everything for most people. You don't win these battles by exploding. You win by becoming incredibly boring and terrifyingly organized. So Ethan shifted gears. Instead of defending himself constantly, he started requesting clarification. Written clarification, very specific clarification. He politely asked the HOA for documentation supporting pathway concerns. He requested formal definitions of visual corridor preservation. He asked about landscaping enforcement standards across neighboring lots. He requested committee records tied to shoreline maintenance. Every email remained respectful, professional, impossible to frame negatively, and suddenly something funny happened. Responses slowed. People got nervous. 12. Because vague authority collapses fast once paperwork enters the room. Marlene, however, escalated again. At another neighborhood gathering, she apparently started describing Ethan as combative. Combative? The man had done nothing except send polite emails and walk to the beach. That detail spread fast enough that even residents who disliked conflict started quietly questioning things, especially after Richard casually mentioned rumors no longer matched reality. Cracks appeared, small ones, enough to matter. Then one rainy afternoon, Ethan noticed runoff erosion near sections bordering the path. Harmless at first glance, but potentially significant under county maintenance rules. Interesting. Very interesting. He documented it, cross-referenced regulations, compared setbacks, called professionals, and somewhere in the middle of reviewing bluff compliance language, a fully legal possibility emerged. Not revenge exactly, correction, administrative correction, the sort that looked painfully reasonable from every angle, because according to county interpretation, improving safety and restoring proper compliance near easements could require structural screening, vegetation management adjustments, erosion barriers, and revised sightline boundaries. Entirely lawful, entirely documented, potentially expensive, potentially inconvenient, and for at least one ocean-facing homeowner, potentially devastating to expectations. When Ethan finally sat alone at his kitchen table surrounded by highlighted zoning papers, survey maps, and attorney notes, something clicked so loudly it almost felt cinematic. He wasn't cornered anymore. He was prepared enough that for the first time since moving in, the neighborhood politics stopped feeling personal. They felt procedural, and procedural battles, and those belonged to Ethan. Because if Marlene insisted on weaponizing rules over a legal beach path, i.e., 13, she had accidentally invited someone who understood exactly how rules actually worked. The strange thing about escalation is that most people imagine it happening with explosions, dramatic confrontations, or emotional speeches, but real property wars almost never move that way. Real escalation arrives disguised as paperwork, inspections, timelines, and polite emails written so calmly they somehow feel more dangerous than shouting. By this point, Ethan Mercer had fully stopped thinking emotionally about Marlene Holloway or the HOA pressure campaign. Emotion had burned off weeks earlier. What remained was process. And process, in Ethan's world, meant patience mixed with precision. After reviewing every survey, county document, shoreline ordinance, and easement rule he could legally obtain, Ethan built something that looked less like neighborhood frustration and more like a professional case file. He categorized photographs by date, organized access obstructions chronologically, logged maintenance irregularities near the easement, cross-referenced, bluff preservation guidelines with setbacks, obligations. Bro, hearing about people doing this level of organization honestly blows my mind because most folks barely sort receipts. Meanwhile, Ethan practically turned suburban irritation into a legal research project. The key realization kept circling back to one thing. Marlene's bluffside ocean view depended on a legally recognized visual corridor crossing adjacent land relationships tied to easement protections and shoreline compliance standards. Her expensive view was not magic, it was infrastructure. Rules maintained it, maintenance obligations preserved it, technical compliance protected it. And technical compliance, inconveniently for Marlene, worked both directions. Weeks earlier, Ethan might have rushed toward confrontation. Now he understood leverage better. 14. The opportunity emerged through something boring enough that most residents would never notice it. Erosion mitigation. Heavy seasonal weather had gradually worsened runoff near sections bordering the beach path. Small instability patterns formed near landscaping transitions close to shared visibility areas. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to trigger county concern if documented correctly under shoreline safety standards. Ethan knew bluff regulations took erosion seriously because unstable access routes meant liability issues, safety concerns, and environmental compliance reviews, meaning someone could not simply ignore it. He commissioned a coastal land use consultant. That part felt important. Not a revenge consultant, not an attorney charging into war, a consultant, professional, objective, somebody whose job involved assessing safety, runoff behavior, and long-term maintenance near coastal access areas. The report came back exactly how Ethan suspected. Minor erosion vulnerabilities existed. Vegetation inconsistencies affected stabilization. Safety improvements near portions of the easement could reasonably justify mitigation recommendations. Temporary screening, revised plant placement, protective barriers, selective height-managed landscaping, drainage adjustments. Bro, this is the moment stories like this become unreal because the revenge energy shifts from emotional to terrifyingly bureaucratic. Nothing scares control-obsessed people faster than regulations they can't socially manipulate. Ethan took another careful step. He filed maintenance clarification requests through proper county channels, not accusations, clarifications. He asked procedural questions regarding shoreline easements, safety obligations, and stabilization standards. Everything remained boring, painfully boring. That mattered because boring wins. 15 people underestimate how powerful administrative neutrality becomes when somebody else has been acting territorial for months. Meanwhile, Marlene unknowingly kept feeding the machine. HOA emails continued, and mailbox compliance reminders, native landscaping recommendations, questions about pathway disturbance. At one point, Ethan even received an oddly formal note concerning outdoor seating placement near his backyard, despite measurements remaining fully compliant. The volume became absurd. Enough that Ethan's attorney quietly suggested preserving evidence of selective enforcement patterns. Selective enforcement. That phrase mattered, because rules applied unevenly stop looking like governance and start looking personal. Around this time, neighborhood gossip shifted too. Residents slowly noticed something weird. Ethan never argued, never yelled, never retaliated publicly. He attended occasional meetings, submitted polite questions, requested clarification in writing. Meanwhile, Marlene reportedly seemed increasingly irritated that things were not working. That dynamic fascinates me because some people genuinely cannot process resistance unless it looks emotional. Calm resistance feels offensive to them. They expect anger because anger gives them a villain. Quiet professionalism leaves them arguing against paperwork. Then came the county correspondence. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just procedural notices acknowledging review of shoreline stabilization considerations near affected access boundaries. Administrative language, try, technical two. The kind of paperwork people ignore until suddenly contractors appear measuring things. Apparently, if mitigation recommendations move forward, portions of bordering visibility areas might require code-compliant screening or structural stabilization buffers to ensure safe access conditions. Temporary in wording, potentially long-lasting in practice. 16. And here sat the uncomfortable truth for Marlene's property. Those modifications risked interrupting sections of the pristine, uninterrupted ocean aesthetic she treated like sacred territory, not permanently destroying it. Nothing reckless, nothing malicious in appearance, just lawful compliance. Lawful compliance tied directly to the same system she spent months weaponizing. Honestly, that part almost feels poetic. People love rules when rules hurt someone else. The moment rules inconvenience them, and suddenly everyone becomes philosophical about fairness. Ethan still did not move aggressively. Instead, he doubled down on patience. He scheduled independent vegetation review and requested maintenance verification around easement edges, documented runoff progression after storms, cross-referenced HOA landscaping expectations against actual neighborhood conditions. Interesting patterns emerged. Very interesting patterns. Several residents, including Marlene, appeared to enjoy flexible interpretations of visual standards, overgrown ornamental features, questionable setback, landscaping, decorative installations nudging guideline boundaries. Nothing huge, but enough to complicate selective enforcement narratives. Ethan quietly archived everything, not for threats, for context. That distinction mattered. Then came the neighborhood committee meeting. The energy reportedly shifted the second Ethan arrived, and residents expected tension, maybe outrage, maybe accusations. Instead, they got calm professionalism. Ethan submitted formal clarification requests regarding beach access interference, easement maintenance standards, and consistency of HOA enforcement practices. Nothing dramatic. No emotional storytelling, no personal attacks, just organized documentation, dates, photos, correspondence, questions. 17, bro. Hearing this just makes me laugh because imagine spending months trying to paint someone as difficult only for them to show up behaving like the calmest project manager alive. That reversal alone probably rattled half the room. Marlene, meanwhile, apparently leaned harder into image management. Her explanations increasingly revolved around community standards and visual preservation concerns. Still vague, still careful, still avoiding direct acknowledgement that the beach path itself had become the issue, but vague language loses power once receipts exist. People started noticing patterns, especially when Ethan's timeline quietly illustrated recurring obstructions near the easement entrance. Decorative planters, rope barriers, landscape narrowing, signage implying restricted access. Nothing singularly dramatic, together very persuasive, and once neighbors began privately wondering whether someone exaggerated a situation, social gravity changes fast. That's exactly how real-life neighborhood politics work. People rarely switch sides overnight. They slowly become embarrassed, then distant, and then neutral, and then suddenly they swear they always felt uncertain. Meanwhile, county review moved at county speed. Slow, careful, unemotional. Inspectors requested photographs, clarifications, access details, and environmental notes. Routine stuff, but routine stuff creates records. Records create recommendations. Recommendations create compliance. And compliance unexpectedly started pointing toward easement stabilization work requiring modest screening measures near portions of the corridor. Nothing massive. No giant wall. No cartoon revenge. Fortress. Just legally appropriate interventions. Potential fencing elements. Vegetation restructuring. Stability features. Visibility interruptions incidental to compliance. Incidental. That word carried beautiful energy because incidental means unfortunate, not intentional. 18. One afternoon, Ethan walked the shoreline path after rain and noticed fresh landscaping modifications suspiciously close to easement boundaries again. Apparently, somebody still hoped inconvenience might solve everything before bureaucracy arrived. At that point, even Ethan reportedly laughed to himself. Months of pressure, months of manipulation, and somehow Marlene still believed the situation remained social instead of procedural. Big mistake, because social battles rely on influence, procedural battles rely on documentation, and Ethan had become frighteningly organized. Then the attorney delivered another quiet reminder. No celebration, no gloating, no triumphal language. Stay reasonable, stay cooperative, stay boring. That advice honestly deserves framing because revenge stories go sideways the second someone gets dramatic. Measured compliance always lands harder. By late spring, contractors had begun quietly evaluating shoreline stabilization possibilities around affected zones. Survey flags appeared, measurements happened, clipboards entered the neighborhood. Nothing paddocks image-conscious communities faster than clipboards. Residents whispered, speculated, wondered why county review suddenly mattered. Marlene reportedly grew noticeably tense, because for the first time, consequences stopped feeling hypothetical. The ocean view she protected like treasure suddenly sat downstream from regulations she herself had helped weaponize. And Ethan remained patient, methodical, and almost unnervingly calm because he understood something everyone else still missed. The real revenge had not even started yet. Everything so far was set up. The machine was only beginning to move. 19, by the time survey flags started appearing near the bluffside easement, the entire neighborhood had entered that uncomfortable stage where everyone pretends nothing unusual is happening while secretly tracking every tiny development like it's prestige television. People slowed walks near Ethan Mercer's property, curtains moved suspiciously, casual conversations suddenly sounded overly casual, which honestly tells you everything. Communities obsessed with appearances become amateur detectives the second consequences show up. And consequences had absolutely arrived. The funniest part, nothing dramatic happened all at once. No shouting match, no explosive confrontation, no HOA meltdown in a parking lot, just paperwork, inspections, compliance language, neutral professionals carrying clipboards with the emotional energy of people who absolutely did not care about neighborhood gossip. Bro, that kind of revenge always feels 10 times scarier because nobody can argue with bureaucracy once it starts moving. You cannot emotionally intimidate zoning language. Weeks after county review began, Ethan received formal recommendations tied to shoreline stabilization and access safety compliance. The language stayed painfully technical. Portions of the easement bordering runoff-sensitive areas required mitigation planning to preserve safe use and long-term stability. Certain bordering sightline interactions might experience incidental interruption during approved improvements. Incidental interruption. There it was again. The phrase practically glowed because translated into ordinary human language. Temporary compliance measures could legally obstruct parts of the pristine visual openness Marlene treasured. Not maliciously, not personally, just structurally, procedurally, entirely by the book. 20, Ethan reviewed every recommendation twice with his attorney and consultant before moving another inch. That detail mattered because he refused shortcuts. If something happened, it had to survive scrutiny from every angle. No loopholes, no gray area stunts, just rules operating exactly as written. And wow, rules written for fairness suddenly looked very inconvenient when fairness arrived. The proposed stabilization work included modest retaining adjustments near runoff zones, vegetation restructuring for slope consistency, and safety screening elements designed to guide pathway movement. Responsively, nothing absurd, nothing ugly, but enough to soften uninterrupted visual access from certain upper sight lines. In short, the path remained usable, the shoreline stayed protected, and Marlene's cinematic ocean framing lost some of its perfectly curated popenness. Legally, that distinction is everything, because hearing this honestly made me laugh, imagining months of someone saying rules matter, only to discover rules have hobbies too. Around this point, whispers spread through the neighborhood. People noticed survey teams, contractors measuring stakes, and environmental review visits. Nobody officially knew details, which somehow made speculation worse. Suddenly, everyone became an expert in bluff maintenance. Residents who probably Googled shoreline terminology 12 minutes earlier started throwing around phrases like erosion corridors and structural visibility transitions at mailboxes. Classic? Neighborhood sociology gets weird fast. Meanwhile, Ethan continued acting painfully normal. Morning coffee, beach walks, friendly nods, professional emails. He did not brag, did not hint, did not threaten. That calmness reportedly frustrated Marlene more than anything else. Because by now, social pressure had failed, the outsider narrative had collapsed. 21 people noticed Ethan behaved reasonably while somehow endless complaints kept orbiting him. Anyway, and then came the HOA meeting that quietly changed everything. Attendance suddenly doubled. Funny how communities become civic-minded once drama enters. Marlene reportedly arrived, polished as always, carrying that same controlled expression of someone determined to narrate reality before reality narrates itself. Ethan came with folders. Just folders? Bro, I swear folders terrify manipulative people more than anger ever could. The meeting started predictably enough. Landscaping, parking, maintenance updates, and then shoreline concerns surfaced. Someone casually asked why county activity suddenly surrounded the easement area. Silence, the uncomfortable kind. Marlene attempted broad language first. Preservation, community consistency, environmental caution. Still vague, still avoiding specifics. Then Ethan calmly requested clarification regarding repeated access interference concerns and ongoing mitigation requirements connected to shoreline safety recommendations. No accusations, and no emotional tone, just calm procedural framing. Then he did something devastatingly simple. Documentation, photographs, dates, emails, timeline, summaries. Again, nothing dramatic individually, but together, incredibly uncomfortable. Plantas appearing repeatedly near access points, decorative chains, narrowing movement, signage implying privacy restrictions. Repeated HOA communications focused disproportionately on him despite comparable neighborhood inconsistencies elsewhere. The room reportedly changed, not loudly, quietly, and that subtle shift where people stop assuming and start realizing, because when facts become organized, stories lose oxygen. One resident apparently asked whether beach access had always been legally protected. Yes, documented, county recognized, title confirmed. 22. Another quietly questioned whether repeated interference risked causing county scrutiny. Also, yes. And suddenly the emotional framing flipped. Instead of Ethan disrupting neighborhood peace, people started connecting an uglier possibility. Months of avoidable escalation had created exactly the administrative attention nobody wanted. That part always amazes me because power games feel clever until paperwork turns public. Then everyone suddenly discovers accountability. Marlene reportedly attempted to redirect toward visual concerns. Huge mistake, because visual concerns tied directly into easement and stabilization conversations now under review, meaning the very justification she leaned on became entangled with compliance obligations. Honestly, that moment sounds cinematic without anyone raising their voice. Just somebody accidentally stepping into consequences built from their own logic. Within days, County notices progressed, not punishments, requirements, recommendations moving toward implementation. Approved shoreline maintenance planning advanced. Survey stakes multiplied. Vegetation review timelines formalized. Temporary protective screening. Approval entered discussion. Again, none of this existed to target Marlene. That distinction mattered legally and narratively. Everything existed because safety standards and access compliance demanded it, and her view complications, incidental. Painfully, hilariously incidental. Ethan reportedly found himself standing outside one afternoon watching contractors discuss measurements near bordering zones when a realization finally landed. Months earlier, he felt trapped, cornered, bullied through inconvenience. Now professionals wearing reflective gear discuss compliance steps nobody could socially pressure away. 23. And because life occasionally writes comedy better than fiction, portions of the mitigation process meant pathway guidance features suddenly interrupted the clean, uninterrupted ocean framing visible from parts of Marlene's property. Not destroyed, just changed enough to notice, enough to matter, enough to sting. Bro, hearing this almost made me clap, because imagine trying to block somebody's beach access only to legally help create the exact administrative process that reshapes your premium view. That level of accidental cell phone deserves study. Neighborhood reactions shifted fast. Some residents quietly apologized to Ethan. Nothing dramatic. Small comments. Awkward admissions. Apparently, stories circulating earlier no longer matched observable reality. Funny how evidence does that. Richard, the older homeowner, reportedly joked that the whole neighborhood suddenly rediscovered the value of minding their own business. Honestly iconic. Meanwhile, Marlene's social influence visibly weakened. Not destroyed, just diminished. Because credibility works like glass. Cracks spread quietly. Once people suspect exaggeration, authority loses shine. And the crudest part for her, Ethan never celebrated publicly, never gloated, never mocked, nothing. He remained respectful in emails, cooperative in meetings, patient during reviews. The exact opposite of what gossip expected. That restraint made the outcome land harder, because nobody could frame him as vindictive, and he looked reasonable, prepared, calm, and the machine had simply reached its conclusion. One rainy evening, after another round of approved shoreline work updates, Ethan walked the beach path alone and paused halfway down the bluff. Ocean wind, gray sky, steady waves, quiet. Months earlier, this path represented stress. Now, it represented something stranger. Proof. Proof that patience mixed with preparation beats manipulation more often than people think. 24. That's exactly how real life works sometimes. Not dramatic revenge. Administrative gravity. People trip over rules they tried weaponizing. And standing there watching waves crash against dark rocks, Ethan realized the story still was not fully over. Because consequences don't end when paperwork finishes. Sometimes the real ending starts after people finally understand what they caused. The strange thing about neighborhood wars is that people imagine endings arriving like movie scenes, full of dramatic apologies, public embarrassment, or somebody storming off forever. But real endings usually arrive quietly. They settle into routines, energy changes, people stop pretending. And for Ethan Mercer, the resolution came not through triumph, but through something far more satisfying. Normalcy, returning on completely different terms. By early summer, shoreline stabilization work had moved into maintenance mode. The beach path remained fully functional, safer than before, and clearly protected through documented compliance standards. Nobody could casually challenge anymore. Temporary screening and landscaping revisions settled into the environment just enough to shift certain bluffside perspectives without turning anything into a spectacle. That part mattered because Ethan never wanted destruction. He wanted fairness. There is a huge difference between revenge driven by chaos and consequences created through accountability. Meanwhile, the HOA atmosphere changed in subtle but obvious ways. The endless compliance emails slowed. Mailbox reminders disappeared. Nobody seemed especially concerned about gravel coloration anymore, which honestly feels hilarious considering how passionately that issue once existed for exactly 5 minutes. Funny how selective standards suddenly calm down once scrutiny becomes mutual. 25 residents who had once kept awkward distance slowly softened. Small conversations happened near driveways. Casual greetings lasted longer. People started treating Ethan less like an outsider and more like somebody who had simply refused to fold under pressure. A few homeowners quietly admitted they had grown tired of constant informal oversight in the neighborhood long before Ethan arrived, but never challenged it because keeping peace felt easier. Bro, hearing that kind of thing always blows my mind because it happens everywhere. One loud personality quietly shapes the behavior of an entire group until someone calmly refuses to play along. Richard, the exhausted retiree who had quietly warned Ethan months earlier, became an unlikely symbol of the shift. He started joking around more openly during neighborhood gatherings and somehow developed the habit of casually redirecting dramatic conversations toward practical ones. The neighborhood itself felt lighter, less tense, like everyone finally remembered coastal living was supposed to involve sunsets and ocean air instead of surveillance, disguised as landscaping concern. As for Marlene Holloway, the transformation looked quieter than people expected. No public humiliation, no dramatic collapse, just distance. Her influence softened as residents became more skeptical of exaggerated concerns and increasingly uncomfortable with conflict framed as community protection. Credibility, once dented, rarely repairs overnight. People still listened politely, but the automatic social gravity she once carried had clearly faded. And Ethan simply lived the life he originally wanted. Morning beach walks returned. Coffee overlooking the bluff felt peaceful again. Guests visited without weird tension orbiting the property. The easement existed exactly as it always legally had. Except now everyone understood it was not up for interpretation. 26. Honestly, that ending feels strangely satisfying because the best revenge stories are rarely about crushing somebody. They're about surviving pressure long enough for reality to catch up. Months after everything settled, Ethan sometimes walked halfway down the shoreline path, paused, and laughed quietly to himself at how absurd the entire saga had become. A legal beach path had stayed legal, and somehow that changed everything. Looking back, Ethan Mercer's story feels like one of those situations that sounds unbelievable until you remember this is exactly how people act when property, control, and status collide. Nobody shouted, nobody flipped tables. The whole thing became a masterclass in patience, paperwork, and malicious compliance energy done legally and calmly. Bro, the wildest part is that Ethan never really won by fighting. Harder, he won by staying organized while everyone else underestimated him. That was incredible. If this story had you hooked, drop a comment with the most absurd HOA or neighbor drama you've ever heard and stick around for more unbelievable property revenge stories.